I had always been a skeptic when it came to the paranormal. Ghost stories, haunted houses, and ancient curses were things I dismissed as figments of overactive imaginations or tales to scare children. Living in the small town of Ravensbrook, I often heard the locals talk about the Blackwood Forest, a place they claimed was cursed and home to malevolent spirits. As someone who prided themselves on rationality and logic, I decided it was time to put these myths to rest. Armed with my flashlight, a camera, and my unwavering resolve, I set out one late evening to explore the forest and debunk the legends once and for all. The sun was setting as I approached the edge of Blackwood Forest. The trees stood tall and imposing, their branches intertwining to form a dense canopy that blocked out much of the remaining light. The air grew colder, and an eerie silence settled around me, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. I took a deep breath, steeling myself for the journey ahead, and stepped into the forest. As I ventured deeper, the light from the setting sun faded, and the forest grew darker. I switched on my flashlight, its beam piercing through the gloom and revealing the twisted shapes of trees and underbrush. The forest seemed to close in around me, and I could feel the weight of the silence pressing down, almost as if the forest itself was watching me. An hour passed, and I found myself in the heart of the forest. The path was overgrown, and the trees grew even thicker, their gnarled branches creating strange, haunting shapes in the darkness. I paused to take a few photos, hoping to capture the eerie beauty of the place. As I reviewed the images on my camera, I noticed something odd. In the background of one of the photos, I could see a faint, shadowy figure standing among the trees. I looked around, shining my flashlight in all directions, but there was no one there. A chill ran down my spine, but I shook it off, attributing the figure to a trick of the light, or a flaw in the camera. I continued on, determined not to let my imagination get the better of me. But as I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It was then that I first heard it, a faint whisper, almost indistinguishable from the rustling leaves. I paused, straining to listen. The whispering grew louder, surrounding me, but there was no one in sight. My heartbeat quickened, and a sense of unease settled in my chest. I tried to rationalize it, telling myself it was just the wind or the creaking of the trees. But deep down, I knew it was something more. The whispers seemed to come from all directions, their words unclear but filled with a sense of urgency and malevolence. I pressed on, my pace quickening as I tried to find the source. The path became more difficult to navigate, and the forest grew darker still, the trees blocking out any remaining light from the night sky. After what felt like hours, the whispers led me to a small clearing. In the center stood an ancient, abandoned cabin, its wooden walls rotting and covered in moss. The roof had partially collapsed, and the windows were dark and empty. The sight of the cabin filled me with dread, but I felt an inexplicable compulsion to approach it. As I stepped closer, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. They spoke of pain, suffering, and vengeance, their voices overlapping in a cacophony of torment. I reached the door and pushed it open, the hinges creaking loudly in the silence. Inside, the air was musty and thick with dust. The floorboards groaned under my weight as I stepped inside, and the whispers seemed to echo off the walls. In one of the rooms, I found an old, dusty journal lying on a broken table. I picked it up and began to read. The journal belonged to someone named Elias Blackwood, who had lived in the cabin many years ago. His entries spoke of strange occurrences in the forest, of voices in the night and shadowy figures that seemed to watch him from the trees. Elias wrote of his growing fear and paranoia, of how he believed the forest was cursed and that something malevolent was watching him. As I read, the whispers grew louder, more frantic. I could feel a presence in the room with me, something dark and malevolent. I turned, my flashlight beam sweeping across the room, but there was no one there. My heart pounded in my chest as I continued to read, each word filling me with more dread. Elias's final entry spoke of a ritual, something he believed would appease the spirits of the forest and lift the curse. He described how he had prepared the cabin for the ritual, drawing the strange symbols on the walls and gathering the necessary items. But his entry ended abruptly, the final words smeared and unreadable. I realized then that the whispers were guiding me, urging me to complete the ritual that Elias had started. I felt an overwhelming compulsion to follow the instructions in the journal, to finish what he had begun. I gathered the items described, old candles, a rusted knife, and a small, ornate box, and placed them in the center of the cabin. As I lit the candles and drew the symbols on the floor, the whispers grew louder still, their urgency palpable. I could feel the presence in the room growing stronger, the air growing colder. My hands shook as I completed the final steps of the ritual, chanting the words Elias had written in his journal. Suddenly, the whispers stopped, and a heavy silence fell over the cabin. I felt a presence behind me, something dark and menacing. I turned slowly, my flashlight illuminating the figure standing in the doorway. It was the same shadowy figure I had seen in the photo, but now it was more distinct, its eyes glowing with a malevolent light. The figure stepped forward, and I felt an overwhelming sense of fear and dread. Its form shifted and flickered like a mirage, and I could see its twisted, contorted features. It was a spirit, a malevolent entity that had been trapped in the forest for centuries. It reached out a hand, and I felt a cold, clammy grip on my arm. Panic surged through me, and I pulled away, stumbling back toward the door. The entity followed, its movements slow and deliberate. I bolted from the cabin, crashing through the underbrush and into the forest. The whispers resumed, now filled with anger and desperation, urging the entity to pursue me. I ran blindly through the forest, branches scratching at my face and clothes. The whispers grew louder, and I could hear the entity behind me, its footsteps heavy and relentless. My flashlight flickered, casting eerie shadows that seemed to dance and writhe around me. I stumbled and fell, my flashlight slipping from my grasp and rolling away. The darkness closed in, and I could feel the entity's presence growing closer. I scrambled to my feet, my breath coming in ragged gasps, and continued to run. The whispers were deafening now, their words a jumbled mess of anger and pain. Just when I thought I couldn't run any further, I burst out of the forest and into a clearing. The whispers ceased, and the entity vanished. I collapsed to the ground, gasping for breath and trembling with fear. I had escaped the forest, but the experience had left me shaken and terrified. I made my way home, my mind racing with the events of the night. I had gone into the forest to debunk the legends, but I had found something far worse than I could have ever imagined. The entity, the whispers, the cabin, they were all real, and they had left a mark on me that I couldn't shake. Days passed, and I tried to put the experience behind me. But the memory of the whispers and the entity haunted me. I could hear the faint whispers in the back of my mind, always there, always waiting. I became paranoid, constantly looking over my shoulder, fearing that the entity had followed me home. One night, as I lay in bed, I heard it, a faint whisper, coming from the shadows of my own home. The entity had followed me, and I knew I would never be free of the whispers in the woods. The legends of Blackwood Forest were true, and I had become a part of them. I decided to document my experience, to warn others of the dangers that lurked in the forest. I wrote down everything, every detail, every whisper. I hoped that by sharing my story, I could prevent others from making the same mistake I had. But deep down, I knew that the whispers would never truly leave me, that the entity would always be there, waiting in the shadows. The Blackwood Forest still stands, its trees tall and imposing, its shadows deep and menacing. The whispers still echo through the trees, and the cabin still waits, abandoned and forgotten. The entity remains, a dark and malevolent presence that cannot be appeased or escaped. And I am left with the knowledge that some legends are real, and some curses can never be broken. As I finish writing this, I can hear the whispers growing louder, their voices filled with anger and pain. The entity is near, and I know that my time is running out. If you are reading this, heed my warning, stay away from Blackwood Forest, and never, ever listen to the whispers in the woods.